Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video review I'm going to be looking at Torment, Tides of Numenera, the Explorer's Guide, written by Shanna Germain and published by Monty Cook Games. Now, the copy I'm reviewing is a colour PDF, approximately 160 pages long. Sean from Monty Cook Games was kind enough to send me the advanced copy for review. Now, please note, before we go any further, this is an uncorrected version, still undergoing final proofing, ready for when the book goes on sale in August. So there may be changes made between now and the final copy. My thanks go out to Monty Cook Games and to Sean for sending me this advanced copy. Now, as you'll probably all know, I am a massive fan of Numenera. The mix of fantasy and weird futuristic science, along with ancient menace, really appeals to me. I thought the rules worked excellently, and they were a great example of a player-faced system where the GM really didn't have to make dice rolls, so they could just concentrate on running the game. Because although dice rolling is fun, I do feel I'll roll a dice to determine what happens randomly can be a little bit of a crutch sometimes. Although I didn't do a review of Numenera at the time, I still plan to get round to it at some point in the future. I ran a short campaign that was one of my favourite online games so far, and seems to be one of the games that certainly my regular group have most enjoyed. You can check it out at the link that I'll post in the description to the playlist. So without further ado, let's get straight into the book. Now, just looking at it, I can see that it has the clean, crisp layout that I've come to expect from Numenera and Monty Cook Games products in general over the years. I love a book that has a clean layout. Now, don't get me wrong, artwork and stuff like that is great and it adds a lot to any game. But overall, what I want to do with the book is read it. Monty Cook Games books always seem to have understood that, and they occupy that beautiful part of the bell curve where they look stunning but in a way that doesn't impede how easy the book is to read, and Torment is no exception. The intro fiction immediately starts hammering home that fusion of high-tech and ancient mysticism that is the calling card of Numenera. In it, a group pray to a god in what could be a scene from any fantasy era game, but as the author pulls the camera back, we discover that they appear to be praying to some sort of ancient holographic array. Part 1 of the book is the introduction, and firstly it covers how a computer game set in the Numenera universe came to be. I found the writers musing about how much a single life matters to be very interesting, and I knew that there was a relation between this book and a computer game. However, as someone who doesn't really play computer games all that often, and after all this is a tabletop RPG channel, I'm not really going to focus on that. Instead, I'm going to review this book on its own merit as a source book for a tabletop RPG. In essence, this book is designed as a toolkit, providing character options, foci, descriptors and geographical information inspired by the game. Part 2 starts off to deal with the setting, and it begins by describing the area known as Greater Goravia, a tumultuous and confusing jumble of different areas held together by faded memories of a once great empire and disjointed legends. I quite like this approach. It speaks of the book's toolkit nature. I think that even if you decided not to use the whole region in a game, it wouldn't be that difficult to transplant one of the areas into your own Numenera campaign. Even at this stage, there are hints of that signature Numenera strangeness dropping into the writer's description. For example, the machine heart, a device that causes changeable and often savage weather to ravage the region. The author also mentions that transdimensional creatures and technology tend to be slightly more prominent in the region, giving the GM free rein to bring in stuff from other Numenera and the strange products. Greater Goravia seems to combine a couple of concepts well beloved of fiction and ancient myth, despite being a cosmopolitan area that has perhaps a higher concentration of strange creatures and Numenera than any other part of the Ninth World. To most of the world's inhabitants, it is also one of those strange lands just over the seas that is spoken of in hushed whispers, when it's spoken of at all. One of the things I enjoyed when reading other Numenera products, and that I'm pleased to see has been kept up here, are the small box outs providing page references for names and concepts mentioned throughout the book. These are a great help when trying to reference things quickly, and are something I'd love to see more games companies adopting in their books. The concept of the changing god is introduced at this point, an entity that has roamed the region for a vast amount of time, creating bodies and casting them off when they cease to be useful for its needs, uncaring that these cast-off bodies then gain sentience and become individuals in their own right. This is an intriguing NPC and brings in something of that extra-dimensional horror element of Numenera that I personally find so appealing. It also opens up a lot of interesting ideas for games involving the cast-offs and perhaps the ultimate aim of this little understood creature. Also covered here are a species or tribe known as the Tabat, a warrior race who exalted combat as the noblest expression of their inner selves, fighting to retain control of lands and a dual structure called the Underspire that they saw as both a god and a means to an end. Now they are little more than a nightmarish tale, the Tabat having been almost completely wiped out by the accidental detonation of a weapon, collapsing their underground city. The Tabat are a good example, in my opinion, of what Numenera does best, providing an evocative history that has no doubt been warped by the passage of time, but that still has an effect on the present day of the campaign, giving the GM a great deal of freedom to mutate the Tabat into whatever their game needs, whilst also providing justification for strange artifacts and creatures found throughout the setting. There is an awful lot of setting detail crammed into this part of the book. If I were to go through it all in detail, this review would be even longer than it is, so I've just picked out a few of my favourite bits. So, here we go. Number one is the mention of airships visiting the Sagus Protectorate. Now, I love airships in RPGs, so their inclusion is a big plus in my eyes. But they could easily be removed if the GM wanted to. But let's face it, why would you want to do that, really? The next thing I enjoyed was the Levies, who are clone-like warriors used to patrol the Sagus Protectorate, created by Aeon priests from donated genetic material in a huge machine. The next thing I liked was the horrifying method of execution used in the Protectorate, where a person's guilt and horror are transmuted into a ropey, entrail-like creature that slowly strangles them before their body and their memories are consumed by an entity known as the Devourer of Wrongs. This had sort of like shades of ancient Egyptian mythology to me, which I'm a big fan of, the weighing of the soul, etc., and being devoured if your sins are too great. Next we have the Psychic War, a hidden conflict fought between a group of thought entities from another dimension and the psychics of the city. Although the war was won, whether all of the adversaries, as the entities became known, were banished is a matter perhaps best not dwelled on for too long. I also loved the mention of a fountain filled with purple fish who gibber in unknown languages. It is believed they speak dead tongues and that a new fish is born whenever our language become extinct. There is the Reef of the Fallen Worlds, a reef made from a conglomeration of ancient technology submerged beneath the waters at the base of the Sagus Cliffs. There is also the Bloom, which I thought was a very interesting idea, a city-sized creature capable of opening doorways to other dimensions when sufficiently induced. In essence, it's sort of like a huge living city that feeds on some of the thoughts of its residents and is avoided by most sensible people. Now, this is body horror writ large as far as I'm concerned, where the danger comes not only from a city's inhabitants, but from the very living walls of the place itself. Extensions of the cities, called moors, roam the veins and capillaries of the city creature, seeking sustenance from blood, memories, desires, or a dozen other things the Bloom may require. If someone provides them with sustenance, then the creature opens a doorway to elsewhere that may be used by the brave or the foolhardy. The city of Ra-Jolioth is an underwater city surrounded by a dome of fresh water, existing in the heart of a desert called the Lost Sea, obelisks rising like curved fingers around the city. There's also the Black Cube, a basalt cube set in the middle of a sprawling wasteland. Each prisoner contained within this huge cube has only vague memories of being sentenced to it for crimes they don't recall, destined to live out their remaining days in the dark confines of the cube, with most of their memories, including their own names, snatched away from them. And finally, although there is a lot more that I really loved in this book that I could go on with, is the Archopelagia, a once great city that existed in the blighted Tempest Waste, once rumoured to have been a place of eternal youth, courtesy of a mechanism called the Revivifier. However, eventually the inhabitants discovered that the Vivifier didn't restore them, it just copied them and rendered down their previous bodies into sludge. However, each body lasts less time than the previous version, necessitating an increased dependence on the Vivifier for any life at all. My previous Numenera campaign focused on a small area where a mechanism created clones of the occupants who believed they were the original, so I was pleased to see something similar in this supplement, albeit with more an entropic twist than I gave it. Scattered throughout the section are small box-out sections containing rumours and story hooks that any GM worth their salt could take and spin out into an encounter or even an entire adventure. These are all very interesting and often focus on one of the strange or weirder aspects of the setting. A brief summary of some of the groups active within the setting follows. These are snapshot views that give an overall look at the group and their goals, in addition to providing some possible benefits for those who join them. For example, a member of the new Tabat gains one of the original Tabat weapons. Part 3 is titled In the World, and it's where we start getting into the rules mechanics section of the book. In a setting as full of strangeness as Torment, it should come as no surprise there are many different Numenera lurking about, strange items of technology that seem almost magical to those who use them, to produce a bewildering variety of effects. 20 additional ciphers, which are sort of one-use Numenera of variable power level, are provided, with the author kindly differentiating between those that can be simply used, anaiotic ciphers, and those that require more effort, occultic ciphers, using a simple icon system. 40 artifacts, and these are Numenera that can be used multiple times, are also provided, ranging from the air skins that can be used to explore underwater environments, like the city of Rajolios, to the stinging mace, a plant-like, cactus-like weapon that exudes a sap that can affect the mental faculties of those struck with it. 20 oddities are also provided. These are minor curious items that have a couple of quirky little properties, and they were one of my favourite parts of Numenera. After all, who wouldn't want to have a miniature planet in a glass sphere, complete with its own weather system? I know I'd certainly like one. Part 3 also provides a handful of creatures encountered in the setting, from the corpuscular maws that are extensions of the living city the Bloom, to the Stykus, strange mutated crustacean-like creatures that might once have been human. These entities are beautifully illustrated and contain all the stats you would need to bring these creatures into your own Numenera game. One of the advantages of the Numenera system, having such simple and easily written stats, is that the author has had a lot more space to lavish on the creature's ecology in a single page entry, unlike some RPGs where the stats take up most of the space and leave only scant room for the background and ecology of the creature. A number of ready-to-use NPCs follow on from this, highlighting some of the options for a Numenera campaign. And speaking of that, let's move on to Part 4, Optional Rules. This part begins by providing new descriptors and foci, the building blocks that help create a Numenera character. Although not necessary to use or enjoy the setting, these options really do help create characters that are tied into this specific part of the Numenera world. For example, a person can create a character born in the womb of the Bloom, or even someone who is a cast-off of the Changing God. Although cast-offs have a strange way of sloughing off pain and distress to those nearby, that I could see being problematic in a group situation. There's a very interesting box out that discusses the possibility of having an entire party of cast-offs. I could see that being very compelling and being an interesting campaign choice. It was definitely something that got me thinking for ideas for campaigns as I was reading it. There is also a new racial option, the aquatic and varied Gebra, although I'm not sure how well they do outside an aquatic environment, since they'd really need specialised Numenera to survive, certainly more arid environments. It could be an interesting conflict in a game though. The penultimate chapter deals with a concept called the Tides, a force set in motion by the Changing God, an invisible force created by some long-forgotten civilization that may or may not be linked to the datasphere, the datasphere being a network of partially functioning nanotech surrounding the Ninth World. Each of the tides is associated with a colour and a number of concepts. The red tide is linked with passion, emotion, action and zeal, for example, while silver is linked with admiration, power and fame. Using these optional rules, the GM awards tide points of a relevant colour when player characters undertake certain actions. When a character progresses to the next tier, total up their points, and whichever one the character has most points in, that is currently in ascendant. They have an affinity for that tide during the entirety of their next tier. The benefits of tide affinity are that you can relate and interact better with those who share your affinity. It can affect the form your reputation takes, and also, if a PC is successful on an action associated with their current affinity and didn't roll a 20, they can choose to get a major special effect as though they had rolled a 20. In a way, the tide rules seem to work like some sort of cross between an alignment system and the way in which Force and Dark Side points were awarded in the old West End Games Star Wars game. The difference is that, unlike alignment, the tides are not a guide or a constraint to role-playing. They simply provide some additional benefits for the main way in which you choose to act when you portray your character. It would be a bit of extra work for the GM, judging and giving out the points, and I'm not sure whether or not the benefits balance out the additional effort, but it's an intriguing idea and one that is after all entirely optional. You don't have to include it in your game. Part 5 is back matter, and the book rounds off with a small primer detailing common slang of the Sega's Protectorate. Now, I absolutely love this bit. It definitely put me in the mind of the old planar cant from the Planescape setting, and would instantly add a note of the weird and elsewareness to a game by its inclusion. So, in conclusion, I absolutely loved Torment, Tides of Numenera, the Explorer's Guide. It was almost like half a dozen different world books crammed into one. There was so much information on different locales and people that I had great difficulty trimming down my list of highlights to include only the ones I mentioned earlier in this video. The supplement is a great toolbox. Think of it as a candy store of Numenera products, complete with numerous shelves containing different brightly coloured candies of strange shapes and sizes, amongst which the GM can wander, freely reaching out and taking down only the ones they want. The book is written in a very clear and concise style that is very easy to read. Despite the staggering amount of information in it, the book never feels cluttered or that something has been skimmed over to make room for something else. Testament, I feel, to the organisation and layout skills of the people involved. Box outs, margin text and icons are all used to great effect to illuminate and elaborate on the material covered, whilst also providing story ideas and jumping off points for the GM that needs that quick hit of inspiration. I don't think this book will be for everyone. Make no mistake, this is Numenera with the weirdness factor cranked up to 11. If you weren't so sold on the extra dimensional or more sci-fi elements of Numenera, you're probably not going to get as much out of this book. However, it wouldn't be difficult to either reskin or just leave occluded some of the more outre elements if you like. Although personally, in a game of weird fantasy like Numenera, I say just chuck them all in. So, let's start with the negative points of the book, of which, to be honest, there aren't many, so that we can end on a positive. Okay, negative points. It may be a little bit weird for some people, and a couple of the locations would require significant elaboration by the GM to make them really sing in a session. Personally, I don't mind this, but some people may be a little bit put off by that. However, those couple of negative points are vastly outweighed by the book's positive points, which are that it's well illustrated, clearly written. There's a lot of information in the book. Terms are explained in box outs. The book has a toolkit approach. Rules are optional and interesting, and there's lots and lots of different ideas for adventures and campaigns in this book. Overall, I think it is a very strong entry in an already accomplished line of products. I defy any GM with more than a passing interest in Numenera to read it and not come up with a dozen or so ideas for campaigns. I certainly thought of a few whilst reading it, and I cannot wait to return to running Numenera in the future. If you're looking for a book bursting with wonderful weirdness and the anachronistic fantasy that Numenera has become famous for, then you will not be disappointed in this book, and I highly recommend you grab hold of a copy as soon as it is released. I'll put a link to Monte Cook Publishing's website down below so that you can keep an eye out for when the book comes out, and like I say, rush out and grab yourself a copy if you have any interest in Numenera or weird science. So until I see you next time, I hope you consider clicking on the red dice just there to subscribe to my channel. You can find us on all the normal social media by looking at the addresses over there. If you have any comments, please put them down below in the comments section or hit me up in the Google Plus links. Until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.